The letter came back 3 times. 3 times, the postmaster in Cheyenne handed it across the counter to a woman nobody wanted, and 3 times she carried it home unopened, because she already knew what it would say. Rejected. Again. And on the 4th attempt, when a rancher named Amos Tull finally agreed to meet her at the depot. He took one look at her from the seat of his wagon, turned the horses around, and drove off without a word. That should have been the end of it. A woman with no more prospects, no more money for postage, and no more names left on the matrimonial list, but she would not stay unclaimed for long. Weeks later, at sunset, a wagon came rattling down that same dusty road toward the depot, and the man driving it, not the man who had turned her away, but one she had not yet met, climbed down, took off his hat, and asked her something nobody had bothered to ask her in 1,100 miles of traveling. He asked her name. The year was 1887, and the town was Cheyenne. Wyoming Territory, a railroad town built on cattle money and the Union Pacific line, where the streets still smelled of coal smoke and fresh-cut pine, and where a man could make or lose a fortune between one cattle season and the next. Her name was Sarah Beckwith, 26 years old, and she had come west the way a great many women came west in those years, by way of a matrimonial newspaper, the kind printed in Chicago and Kansas City, filled with columns of lonesome ranchers and homesteaders looking for wives to help them hold their claims. Sarah had answered 4 advertisements. 2 men never wrote back. One changed his mind when he learned she'd been a school teacher and not a farm girl, worried she'd think herself too fine for chores. The 4th was Amos Tull, who ran 1,100 acres of grazing land 20 miles north of town, and who had, after months of careful letters, sent her a train ticket. She had crossed half a continent on the strength of that ticket. 4 days on the rails, sleeping upright in coach class because a sleeping berth cost money she didn't have, eating crackers and dried apples from a tin, watching the flat green of Illinois turn to the gold plains of Nebraska, and then the high, empty country of Wyoming. And when she stepped off the platform at Cheyenne Depot, in her one good traveling dress, carrying a single carpet bag with everything she owned, Amos Tull looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he's decided not to buy. He didn't explain himself. He didn't so much as offer her a ride into town. He just turned his wagon around and left her standing on the platform with the dust settling around her boots. The station master, a stooped, kindly man named Higgins, had seen this before. Cheyenne sat on the rail line for the entire territory, and every month or so a woman got off that train with a letter in her hand and no one waiting to claim her. Higgins kept a back room with a cot in it, for exactly this reason, and he let Sarah stay there 2 nights while she decided what to do. "You could write your family," he said. "Ask for fair home." "I don't have a family left to write to," Sarah said. "That's rather the whole reason I answered the advertisement." Higgins didn't press further. He'd learned not to. In a rail town like Cheyenne, a man who ran the depot saw every kind of arrival: soldiers bound for the frontier posts, drummers selling everything from sewing machines to patent medicine, and no small number of women just like Sarah, clutching a letter and a ticket, and a hope that hadn't yet been tested against the truth of the man waiting for them. Some of those arrangements worked out fine. Higgins had danced at more than one wedding that started that very way. But he'd also learned a woman turned away at the platform rarely had anywhere good left to go, and he made it his quiet business, when he could, to see they weren't simply left standing in the dust. On the 2nd evening, over a supper of beans and salt pork cooked on the little stove in the back room, he told her something that turned her cold. "You're not the first he's turned away," Higgins said, not unkindly but plainly. "Tull's had 3 women come through on that same arrangement in 2 years. First one left after 4 months, packed her bag and caught the eastbound train, wouldn't say why. Second one never got off the train at all. Tull sent word ahead not to bother, changed his mind before she even arrived. Third one, he stopped." "Third one what?" Sarah asked. "Third one didn't leave," Higgins said. "Not that anybody saw anyhow. Just stopped writing to her people back in Ohio. They wrote to the sheriff eventually, asking after her. Sheriff wrote out, talked to Tull, and came back saying she'd gone on to California with a drummer she'd taken up with. Tull had a letter to prove it, in her own hand, or so he said. Sarah felt the carpetbag heavy in her lap. And you believe that? Higgins shrugged, the way a man shrugs when he's decided it isn't his business. Nobody had cause not to. Sheriff Coyle's a fair man. If he was satisfied, I suppose the rest of us had to be. But Sarah noticed he didn't say he was satisfied. Only that Coyle was. She might have left it there. A woman alone in a strange territory, penniless, with a return fare she couldn't afford, had little enough business chasing rumors about a man who'd already refused her. But something about the way Higgins had stopped mid-sentence stayed lodged in her like a splinter. The next morning, she walked the length of Cheyenne's Main Street, past the Mercantile and the Inter-Ocean Hotel, and 2 saloons already doing business before 9 o'clock, until she found the small frame building with a shingle reading J. Costyle, Sheriff, Laramie County. Sheriff Jim Coyle was younger than she expected, not yet 40, with a sun-cracked face and a Colt Peacemaker worn low and plain on his hip, no ornament to it, the mark of a man who carried it for use and not for show. Miss Beckwith, he said when she gave her name. Higgins telegraphed ahead that you might come see me, said you had questions about the Tull place. The office smelled of pipe tobacco and gun oil, and a rifle rack behind the desk held 2 Winchesters and a shotgun, kept clean and ready the way a careful lawman kept them in a territory still 5 years shy of statehood, where a sheriff might ride 2 counties in a single week, settling everything from cattle rustling to drunken brawls outside the saloons on 16th Street. I have questions about a woman who was supposed to marry him, Sarah said. Before me. Eleanor Fitch, I believe her name was. Coyle's expression didn't change, but his hand went still on the desk. Eleanor Fitch went on to California. I saw the letter myself. Did you see her write it? A pause. No. Then you saw a letter that claimed to come from her hand. That isn't the same thing, Sheriff, and I expect you know it. Coyle studied her a long moment. The way a man studies a poker hand he hadn't expected to be dealt. You're a schoolteacher, Higgins tells me. I was 2 years in Ohio, before the school closed for want of funds. Schoolteachers read handwriting for a living, Coyle said slowly. I don't suppose you'd know Eleanor Fitch's hand if you saw it. No, but her family in Ohio would. It was, Sarah would later think, a strange sort of investigation for a woman with no standing, no money, and no particular business in Laramie County at all. But Coyle agreed to wire the Fitch family for a sample of Eleanor's handwriting. A thing that cost 15 cents a word over the telegraph wire and took the better part of 2 days to arrange, since the message had to travel first to Omaha and then east on the connecting lines before it reached a small town in Ohio at all. While they waited, Sarah did not sit idle. She had nowhere else to be, and Higgins let her keep the cot another few nights, in exchange for helping him sort freight manifests, work she was well suited to, being neat-handed and quick with figures. It was there, sorting through months of old freight and mail records for the Cheyenne depot, that she found the second thread. Amos Toole had a standing account for supplies delivered out to his ranch. Flour, tinned goods, dry goods, the ordinary stock of a working spread. But 18 months back, in the same month, Eleanor Fitch was said to have vanished east toward California. There was a curious gap. No goods ordered for 6 weeks. Then, all at once, a large order, twice the usual flour, twice the usual coffee, and a length of black morning crepe from the Mercantile, the kind used to drape a doorway or a coffin. Sarah sat very still with that ledger page in her hands for a long while, the depot's lamp guttering low beside her, throwing long shadows across the rows of freight entries, barrels of flour at $4, tins of coffee, bolts of calico, the ordinary arithmetic of frontier survival stretching back 2 full years in Higgins's careful hand. Morning crepe meant a death. Every soul in the territory knew as much. A household in mourning draped its doorway and its looking glasses in black, and a widow wore the crepe herself for a full year afterward, sometimes longer, as custom required. But there had been no funeral notice in the Cheyenne Daily Leader for anyone at the Tull Ranch. No burial recorded at the county cemetery where Sarah had walked once already, reading headstones out of simple restlessness. No minister's record, no notice posted at the church door, no mention at all, a death without a grave. A mourning cloth bought for no one the town had ever been told to grieve. So who had died, and why had nobody been told? The telegraph reply from Ohio came on the 4th day, and it did not say what Coyle had expected. The handwriting in the letter that claimed to be from Eleanor Fitch, the family wrote, did not match a single sample they possessed of her hand. Not her school certificate, not her confirmation letter, not so much as a grocery list she'd left behind. The E's were formed wrong. The whole letter, in fact, read stiff and formal, in a way Eleanor never wrote, more like a man's hand trying to imitate a woman's. Coyle read it twice at his desk, then looked up at Sarah with the particular grimness of a lawman who has just realized he made a mistake 18 months old. I ought to have asked for a sample the first time, he said. I took Tull at his word because Tull's always been square with me before. Paid his taxes on time. Never caused trouble in town. A man like that you don't expect. You don't expect a murderer to look like anyone else, Sarah said quietly. But he never does he? It was the word neither of them had said aloud until then. Murderer. Once spoken, it seemed to change the air in the small office. We don't know that, Coyle said, though his voice lacked conviction. A woman can die of fever, of accident, of 100 honest things, and a frightened man might still lie about it, rather than have folks think ill of him. Then why lie at all? Why not simply say she died and grieve her properly, and let the county record it? Sarah asked. Unless the truth of how she died was a good deal worse than fever. Coyle stood, reached for his hat and the shotgun kept behind his desk. A Winchester model 1887, new enough that he'd only had it a few months. A fine piece for a lawman riding out to a place he no longer trusted. I'm riding out to the Tull place, he said. You'd best stay in town. I'd best come with you, Sarah said. He never told me his reasons for turning me away at the depot. Perhaps it's time I asked him myself. It was near 4 in the afternoon when they set out. Coyle on his gelding, Sarah in the sheriff's spring wagon, since she had no horse of her own, and no experience riding one regardless. The road north out of Cheyenne ran through open range country, sagebrush and short grass stretching gold to the horizon. The Laramie Mountains a blue smudge to the west. 20 miles was a half-day's travel by wagon in that country, and neither of them spoke much along the way, each turning over the same cold question. What had happened to Eleanor Fitch? Along the way they passed a line shack and a stretch of drift fence, and once, far off, a rider pushing a small bunch of cattle toward a stock tank. Ordinary sights in that country, unremarkable in any other season. But Sarah found herself studying every distant figure now, wondering what secrets a man might keep on land this wide and this empty, where a scream could carry half a mile and still never reach a neighbor's ear. The Tull Ranch sat in a shallow valley along a creek, a modest frame house with a barn twice its size, the mark of a man who valued his stock over his own comfort, not uncommon among cattlemen of that era, when the herd was the entire fortune, and the house merely where a man slept between roundups. Amos Tull came out onto the porch when he heard the wagon, and Sarah saw something cross his face when he recognized her beside the sheriff. Not quite fear, but something adjacent to it, the look of a man doing arithmetic very quickly. Sheriff, Tull said. Miss Beckwith. Didn't expect to see you again. I imagine not, Coyle said. We've come about Eleanor Fitch. Tull's jaw worked once. Told you all I know about that a year and a half back. She went on to California. Her family says the letter wasn't in her hand, Coyle said. And the freight ledger in town shows you bought morning crepe the same month she disappeared. No death recorded. No notice in the paper. I'd like you to explain that to me plain, Amos, before this goes any further than the two of us standing here. For a long moment, Tull said nothing at all. Somewhere behind the house, a dog barked twice and fell silent. Then Tull's shoulders dropped, the posture of a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying a long while. She's not dead, he said. God help me, she's not dead. Come with me, I'll show you. But I'd ask you both to hold your judgment till you've seen it. He led them past the barn, past a spring house built into the creek bank, to a small outbuilding Sarah had taken for a root cellar or a smokehouse. A low structure of thick sod and timber, half sunk into the hillside. The kind of dugout many settlers built as a first shelter before they could afford a proper frame house. Tull lifted the wooden bar across the door and stepped back. Inside, in the dim light through one small window, sat a woman, thin pale, her hair grown long and unkempt but alive. She flinched at the light and then, seeing Sarah's face, began to weep. "Eleanor," Coyle said, and his hand had gone to his Colt without seeming to know it moved there. "Amos, what in God's name?" "She's not right," Tull said, his voice cracking now. "You have to understand. She was fine when she first come out, sweet-tempered, glad for the match. Then about 2 months in, something changed. She'd wake screaming in the night. She set fire to the hay barn once, near burned the whole place down, said the flames were talking to her. I took her to the doctor in Cheyenne, and he said there wasn't a cure, said the asylum in." He stopped, swallowed. "Said the territorial asylum was the only place for her, and I couldn't send her there, Sheriff. You've heard what those places are. Chains, cold rooms. I read about the one in Illinois, women left to rot for decades over nothing worse than melancholy. I couldn't send her to that. So I kept her here, told everyone she'd gone, wrote the letter myself, badly I know, because I never was much for writing. I thought I was protecting her." The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel. "You imprisoned her," Sarah said finally, her voice not unkind but not forgiving either. "Whatever your reasons, Amos, you took away every choice she had. That isn't protection. That's a different kind of cage." It fell to Sheriff Coyle to sort out what the law required, and in the Wyoming Territory of 1887, the law on such matters was neither simple nor especially humane by later standards. There was no easy path for a woman suffering what the doctors of the day called nervous affliction or brain fever. The territorial asylum at Evanston was indeed grim, chronically underfunded, more a place of confinement than of healing, and Coyle himself had ridden past it once and never forgot the sound of it. But keeping a woman locked in a dugout, however gently intentioned, was plainly a crime, unlawful restraint, if nothing worse, and Coyle told Tull as much. Plainly, standing there in the fading light. "I ought to arrest you," Coyle said, "and likely will once I've sorted what charge fits best. But first we're getting her out of that hole and into a proper bed. And we're sending for Dr. Reams from town, and you're going to answer to a judge for every week you kept her there." Tull didn't argue. Something in him seemed to have already surrendered, as though the confession itself had used up whatever fight remained in him. It was Sarah, in the end, who sat with Eleanor Fitch through that first night, in the small frame house Eleanor should have called home 18 months before. Coyle had ridden hard back to town for Dr. Reams, leaving the two women alone by lamplight, and for a long while Eleanor said nothing at all, only stared at the window as though she expected the darkness beyond it to close back over her the moment anyone looked away. She was thin as a fence rail and flinched at sudden movement, the door especially, but she was not, Sarah came to believe over the following hours, so far gone as Tull had claimed. Frightened, yes. Confused by long confinement and poor food, certainly. Her hands shook when she lifted the cup of broth Sarah warmed for her, and she ate slowly, like someone relearning a skill gone rusty from disuse. But when Sarah spoke to her softly, asked her simple questions, told her the year and the day and where she now sat, something in Eleanor's eyes came back into focus, slow as a lamp turned up by degrees. "You came on the train," Eleanor said once, near midnight, not quite a question. "The same as I did." "I did," Sarah said. "Did he turn you away at the depot too?" "He did." Eleanor's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't far from one either. "Then I suppose you're the lucky one after all. He wasn't cruel," Eleanor whispered once, near dawn. "That's the strange part. He brought me food. He read to me sometimes. He just never once asked if I wanted the door open." It was, Sarah thought, perhaps the saddest sentence she had ever heard spoken. Dr. Reams, who had trained back east before coming to practice in Cheyenne, as many frontier doctors had, since medical schools were scarce west of the Missouri, examined Eleanor 2 days later and gave his judgment plainly. She had suffered what he called an attack of the nerves, likely worsened by isolation and poor diet. But she was not mad, and with proper rest, food, and daylight, he expected a full recovery. It was, he noted dryly, remarkable how often a diagnosis of madness turned out to be nothing more than a woman who had been failed by everyone meant to care for her. Amos Toll stood trial that autumn in the county courthouse, a modest brick building that also served, that same season, for grange meetings and the occasional traveling preacher. The territorial court convened only twice a year in counties as sparsely settled as Laramie. Riding circuit judges brought in from Cheyenne's district bench, and the whole town turned out for it, the way they might turn out for a hanging or a 4th of July parade, filling the hard wooden benches until men stood 3 deep along the back wall. Tull was convicted of unlawful imprisonment and sentenced to 4 years at the territorial prison in Laramie, a lighter sentence than some in town thought he deserved. But frontier juries, Sarah learned, were often as swayed by a man's reputation and his years of honest tax-paying as by the facts laid plainly before them. 12 men, all of them ranchers or merchants who'd shaken Tull's hand at one time or another, over a cattle deal or a store counter, found it easier to believe in a man gone wrong out of misguided love than in a man gone wrong out of something colder. Eleanor Fitch, once her strength returned, chose not to go home to Ohio. She took work instead at the Cheyenne Mercantile, keeping the very ledgers that had first betrayed Tull's lie, and in time she and Sarah became close as sisters, 2 women bound together by a secret only the 2 of them, and Coyle fully understood. As for Sarah herself, she assumed her story with Wyoming Territory had reached its natural end. She had no husband, no prospects, and a return fare she still could not afford. She began asking Higgins, without much hope, whether the depot might need a hand with its ledgers permanently. She never expected the wagon to come back. It was near sunset on the 3rd day after Tull's arrest when she heard wheels on the road outside Higgins's office, and looked up to see a wagon she didn't recognize. Not Tull's, but a neighboring rancher's, a man named Caleb Whitfield, who ran cattle on the section adjoining Tull's land, and had given testimony at the trial about hearing screams from the direction of the dugout, screams he'd been too uncertain to report at the time. Whitfield climbed down slow, turning his hat in his hands the way a man does when he's rehearsed something and forgotten half of it. "Miss Beckwith," he said, "I expect you don't know me proper. I'm the one told the judge about the noise I heard, back before any of this come out plain." "I remember your name from the trial," Sarah said. "You did a brave thing, speaking up." "Didn't feel brave," Whitfield said. "Felt like I should have spoken sooner. Man doesn't sleep easy on a thing like that." He paused. "I heard you're looking for work, and lodging besides. Fact is, my sister kept house for me till she married last spring, and I've had nobody to manage the place since. I've 1,100 acres and no wife, Miss Beckwith, and I know that sounds like exactly the kind of arrangement put you through hell already. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking, would you consider honest wages, keeping my books and my house, till such time as you've got enough put by to go wherever you please. No arrangement beyond that. Just work, and a fair wage, and a door that's never once locked." Sarah studied him a long moment. This stranger who had watched his neighbor's cruelty unfold for months, and finally found the courage to speak against it, offering now not a marriage, but simply a door that opened both ways. "Why did it take you so long, Mr. Whitfield? To speak up, I mean." "Because I told myself it wasn't my business," Whitfield said, "and there was no self-pity in it, only plain honesty. I've had a year and a half to think on what that cost. I'd rather not make that mistake twice." She took the position. It was, in the end, a smaller and quieter ending than the matrimonial advertisements had promised her back in Ohio. No grand romance, no sudden fortune, only honest wages and a room of her own and a door, as promised, that was never once locked against her. But 3 weeks into her work at the Whitfield place, keeping his accounts as neat and careful as she'd once kept Higgins's freight ledgers, Caleb Whitfield began driving into town of an evening, On no particular errand Sarah could discern, and each time he found some reason to pass by the depot where she'd once waited, alone, for a man who never came. It was on one such evening, the sky gone the color of a branding iron pulled fresh from the fire, that he finally climbed down from the wagon seat, hat in hand once more, and asked her, not for her hand this time, and not out of any advertisement or arrangement, but simply because he wanted to know. Sarah, I never rightly asked, would you tell me your middle name? I find I'd like to know the whole of you, if you'll allow it. It was such a small question. Smaller than a proposal, smaller than a promise. But it was, Sarah understood, the first time in 1,100 miles of traveling that anyone west of the Mississippi had asked her anything at all, simply because they wished to know the answer. And not because a form needed filling, or a contract needed signing, or a stranger needed a wife to hold his claim. She told him. And the two of them stood there a while longer, as the sun went down over the Laramie plains, in no particular hurry to say anything more. Eleanor Fitch lived another 40 years in Cheyenne. She never married, kept the mercantile's books until her eyesight failed her, and rarely spoke of the dugout again, save once, late in her years, to a young newspaperman gathering stories of the old territory days. He noted only that she'd said the worst part of her captivity was never the walls, nor the cold, but the plain fact of never once being asked. Amos Tull served his sentence and left the territory upon his release. History does not record where he went after, and in an old Laramie County courthouse ledger, in ink gone brown with age, there remains a record of a case the town called, for years afterward, simply the matter of the woman in the hillside. Sarah told Caleb her middle name. It was Ruth. He said it back to her once, quietly, as though testing the weight of it, and then he said nothing more at all. Just stood there beside the wagon, while the light went from gold to purple over the plains, in no particular hurry, for once, to be anywhere else. Until next time, keep exploring the story's history almost forgot.